Mary shifted uncomfortably in her worn janitor's uniform, the fabric scratchy against her skin. The bustling kitchen of the high-end restaurant she had been assigned to inspect was a chaotic symphony of clattering pots, shouted orders, and the sizzling hiss of food being cooked. The aroma of spices and fresh ingredients filled the air, but the visual reality was far less appetizing. Grease-streaked counters and sticky floors told a story of neglect. Mary had seen worse during her years as an inspector, but she hadn't expected this from a place with such a sterling reputation. Her role was simple: undercover janitor. She had insisted on anonymity to get an unfiltered view of the restaurant's daily operations. As she mopped the corner of the kitchen near the dishwashing station, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her stomach churn. Workers complained in hushed tones about the long hours, unfair deductions from their paychecks, and the impossible standards imposed by the restaurant manager, Greg. Greg himself was a force to be reckoned with, or so he thought. A towering man with a booming voice and a permanent sneer etched onto his face, Greg commanded the staff not with respect but through fear and intimidation. Mary had observed his behavior over the past few days, taking careful mental notes. He berated cooks for minor mistakes, humiliated servers in front of customers, and seemed to take particular pleasure in making the dishwashers feel insignificant. Mary had noted his every word and action, her sharp mind cataloging violations as naturally as breathing. "Hey, janitor!" Greg's voice cut through the air like a whip. Mary looked up from her mop bucket, meeting his gaze without flinching. He stood in the doorway to the break room, his arms crossed over his chest. "What do you think you're doing, taking a break in there? That area's for staff. You don't count." Mary straightened her back, gripping the mop handle tightly. "I've been cleaning nonstop for hours. I thought I'd take 5 minutes." Greg barked out a laugh, loud and condescending. 5 minutes? Lady, you're here to clean, not to lounge around. You don't get to decide when you take a break. You take one when I say you can, and guess what? I don't think you've earned it." The other staff members averted their eyes, some glancing at Mary with pity, others with silent resignation. None dared to speak up, and Mary didn't expect them to. She wasn't here for sympathy, she was here to uncover the truth. Mary pushed her mop bucket aside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Understood," she said calmly, her voice betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. She picked up her mop again and resumed her work, silently vowing to remember every detail of this encounter. Later that afternoon, her stomach growled audibly as the lunch rush wound down. She hadn't eaten all day, and the tantalizing smell of grilled steak and roasted vegetables only made the hunger more pronounced. She ventured toward the kitchen counter, where leftover staff meals were typically placed. A few plates of food sat untouched, and Mary hesitated before reaching for one. "What do you think you're doing now?" Greg's voice boomed again, this time from across the kitchen. He stalked toward her like a predator zeroing in on its prey. The room seemed to shrink under his presence. "I thought these were staff meals," Mary said, keeping her tone even. "I haven't had lunch yet." Greg smirked, shaking his head. "Staff meals are for real staff, not hired help like you. You're lucky we let you drink water from the tap. Now get back to work, before I dock your pay for slacking off." Mary clenched her jaw, but said nothing. She returned to her mop, feeling the eyes of the kitchen staff on her. She could tell they were too afraid to intervene, bound by the invisible chains of their dependence on this job. As she worked, she noticed more concerning details. Raw chicken sat uncovered on a cutting board next to fresh vegetables, cross-contamination waiting to happen. The walk-in freezer door was propped open with a box of frozen shrimp, causing the temperature to fluctuate dangerously. A server, clearly overwhelmed, dropped a tray of glasses, and instead of helping, Greg berated her loudly for being clumsy, his words echoing across the room. Mary's sharp eyes darted from one violation to the next, her mind recording everything like a camera. She noticed a young dishwasher with tired eyes scrubbing the same pan for what seemed like an eternity, the industrial soap causing his hands to turn red and raw. She made a mental note to speak to him later, quietly, when Greg wasn't around. By the end of her shift, Mary's back ached, her hands were pruny from hours of cleaning, and her stomach felt like it was eating itself. She retreated to the storage room, where she had stashed a granola bar in her pocket. Sitting on an overturned crate, she took a bite, her resolve hardening with each chew. This wasn't just about Greg's personal cruelty, it was about a system that allowed people like him to thrive. It was about the workers who suffered in silence, too afraid to lose their jobs, and the customers who unknowingly paid premium prices for food prepared in unsanitary conditions. Mary pulled out her notebook and began scribbling furiously, every detail fresh in her mind. She didn't need the break room, the staff meals, or Greg's approval. What she needed was justice, and she was determined to deliver it. As the restaurant closed for the night and Greg strutted out like a king leaving his court, Mary lingered behind, studying every corner of the place. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she wasn't going to stop until Greg and his operation were held accountable. Mary's notebook became her constant companion, each page filled with meticulous notes written in shorthand only she could decipher. The violations were everywhere, embedded in the fabric of the restaurant's daily operations, like stains no amount of scrubbing could erase. Each discovery added weight to her growing case against Greg and his toxic management practices. The first major red flag came during the early morning food deliveries. Mary observed the arrival of the produce truck, expecting to see crates of fresh vegetables and fruits. Instead, she watched as the driver unloaded boxes that were visibly wilted and bruised. One box of lettuce was so brown and slimy that Mary had to suppress a grimace. The kitchen staff seemed resigned to the poor quality, quietly washing and chopping the vegetables without complaint. "Why are you using this?" Mary asked a cook named Rosa during a rare lull in the kitchen chaos. Rosa hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Greg wasn't nearby. "This is what we get," she said quietly. "Greg switched suppliers a few months ago. Said it was cheaper." Mary frowned, scribbling notes. "Cheaper doesn't mean safer. Does anyone ever report this?" Rosa shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we complain, Greg threatens to cut our hours. Some of us can't afford that." Mary nodded solemnly. Rosa's words confirmed what Mary had suspected: the staff was trapped, too afraid to stand up for themselves. Later, while mopping the dining area, Mary overheard a conversation between two servers. One of them, a young man named Ethan, looked particularly distressed. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "My paycheck's always short. I asked Greg about it, and he said I must have made a mistake clocking in." The other server, a woman in her 30s named Carla, sighed. "You're not the first. He does it to all of us, hoping we won't notice. Last week, he docked me for taking too long on a break I didn't even take." Mary's hand tightened around the mop handle. Wage theft, intimidation, and unsafe working conditions. It was becoming clear that Greg's mismanagement extended far beyond the kitchen. The kitchen itself was a breeding ground for violations. Mary spent hours cleaning, giving her ample opportunity to observe the glaring issues no one else seemed to address. The deep fryer's oil hadn't been changed in what appeared to be weeks, leaving a layer of black sludge at the bottom of the vat. The walk-in cooler, which was supposed to store perishable items at a safe temperature, had a faulty thermostat. Mary watched as a chef checked the temperature, sighed, and adjusted it manually with a screwdriver, a temporary fix for a chronic problem. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when Mary spotted Greg himself mishandling food. She was cleaning near the prep station when she saw him take a piece of raw chicken and throw it directly onto the grill without washing his hands. He then barked at the cook next to him to plate the finished dish for a waiting customer. "Boss, you didn't wash your hands," the cook said hesitantly. Greg glared at him. "And? The heat'll kill whatever's on it. Stop wasting time and do your job." Mary froze, her jaw tightening as she watched the interaction. It wasn't just negligence, it was outright contempt for basic health standards. When the opportunity arose, Mary began speaking to the workers individually, earning their trust through quiet acts of kindness. She offered a spare bandage to the dishwasher, Danny, when she noticed his hands were red and cracked from the harsh cleaning chemicals. "They won't let me use gloves," Danny admitted, his voice barely audible. "Greg says it slows me down." Mary's heart sank. "You should never have to work like this," she said gently. Danny shrugged, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What choice do I have? My mom's sick, and this is the only job I could find." Each story Mary uncovered added another layer to the grim picture. Carla had been denied sick leave, forced to work through a high fever. Rosa revealed that Greg occasionally borrowed tips from the jar at the end of the night, claiming it was to cover shortages in the register. Ethan confided that he had once been yelled at so harshly by Greg in front of customers that he cried in the bathroom afterward. Mary listened intently, her anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. These people weren't just employees, they were human beings trying to make an honest living under impossible circumstances. Greg's arrogance and greed had turned their workplace into a nightmare. Greg, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of Mary's true purpose. To him, she was just the janitor, a background character in his little kingdom. He barked orders at her with the same disdain he showed everyone else, treating her as if she were invisible until he needed something. "Hey, janitor," he yelled one afternoon, tossing a broom at her feet. "The restroom's a mess. Go handle it. And make sure it doesn't stink when you're done." Mary picked up the broom without a word, biting back the retort that sat on the tip of her tongue. She had bigger plans than putting Greg in his place verbally. His downfall would come, but it would be on her terms. As the days passed, Mary's notebook filled with detailed accounts of expired ingredients, unsanitary practices, and worker exploitation. She took photos when she could, discreetly snapping pictures of the walk-in cooler, the grease-coated fryer, and the piles of expired produce shoved into the corner of the storage room. Each piece of evidence brought her one step closer to her goal. Greg, ever oblivious, continued to strut around the restaurant like a self-proclaimed king. He mocked Mary openly, calling her janitor lady in front of the staff and customers. But Mary didn't flinch. Every insult only fueled her determination to bring him down. The investigation was far from over, but Mary was confident she had enough to build an airtight case. The time to act was drawing near, and Greg had no idea what was coming. For now, Mary continued her quiet work, biding her time and gathering every shred of evidence she needed to ensure that when Greg fell, he would fall hard. Mary woke early on inspection day, her nerves steely but her resolve unwavering. She dressed sharply in her official inspector uniform, a crisp navy blazer with the logo of the Food Safety and Standards Board emblazoned on the pocket, and reviewed her notes one last time. Every violation, every photograph, every first-hand account she had collected over the past weeks was organized into a meticulous report. Today, Greg's reign of terror would end. The restaurant staff bustled about as they prepared for the lunch rush, unaware that their lives were about to change. Greg, as always, was barking orders, his voice reverberating through the kitchen. He berated a cook for slicing vegetables too slowly and chastised a server for not smiling enough. The atmosphere was tense, the workers moving like cogs in a machine, afraid of drawing Greg's ire. When Mary entered the restaurant, clipboard in hand, she immediately turned heads. Her professional demeanor and authoritative presence were a stark contrast to the quiet janitor she had pretended to be. Greg, standing near the hostess podium, squinted at her in confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone laced with annoyance. Mary gave him a polite but firm smile. "Mary Henderson, lead inspector for the Food Safety and Standards Board. I'm here to conduct a formal inspection of your restaurant." Greg's face froze, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. "Inspection? We weren't told about any inspection." "That's the point of an unannounced inspection," Mary replied smoothly. "It allows us to see the true state of your operations. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll need access to all areas of the restaurant." Greg blinked, his mind clearly racing. Sure. Right this way," he stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. Mary began her inspection in the dining area, where she immediately noticed several glaring issues. The chairs and tables were sticky, and the floor beneath the booths was littered with crumbs and bits of paper. She took notes and snapped a few photos, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. Greg hovered nearby, trying to act nonchalant but failing miserably. "You know, we've just been so busy lately," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "The customers love us, and sometimes it's hard to keep up with the little things." Mary didn't respond, moving methodically from one area to the next. When she reached the kitchen, the atmosphere changed. The staff, many of whom had recognized her, exchanged glances of excitement and hope. "Good morning," Mary said to the cooks, her tone professional but kind. "Please continue your work as usual. I won't interrupt more than necessary." Greg trailed behind her like a shadow, occasionally barking orders at the staff in a feeble attempt to assert control. But it was clear to everyone that the power dynamic had shifted. Mary was in charge now. The kitchen was a treasure trove of violations. Mary inspected the deep fryer, noting the thick layer of black sludge at the bottom. She measured the temperature of the walk-in cooler, confirming that it was several degrees too warm to safely store perishable items. She opened a container of raw chicken and frowned at the foul smell emanating from it. "These ingredients are well past their expiration date," Mary said, making a note. "How long have they been stored here?" One of the cooks glanced nervously at Greg, who glared back at him. I don't know," the cook stammered. Mary turned to Greg, her expression steely. "As the manager, you should be aware of your inventory's condition. Do you perform regular checks?" Greg's face turned red. "Of course I do," he blustered. "This must have slipped through the cracks." Mary's raised eyebrow spoke volumes. She moved on, checking the cleanliness of the equipment. The cutting boards were deeply scarred and stained, harboring bacteria. The grease trap beneath the stove was overflowing, a ticking time bomb of fire hazards. Mary documented everything with precision, her calm demeanor masking her growing anger. As Mary continued her inspection, she made it a point to speak to the staff. She asked the dishwasher, Danny, about the gloves she had previously noticed were unavailable. "I'd really like to use gloves," Danny admitted, his voice trembling. "But Greg says they cost too much and slow me down." Mary wrote that down, her pen scratching the clipboard. "Thank you, Danny. That's important information." She approached Rosa, who was chopping vegetables on a questionably clean cutting board. "Rosa, do you often receive shipments of produce like this?" Mary gestured to a box of wilted lettuce. Rosa nodded hesitantly. "Almost every week. Greg says it's what we can afford." Greg, standing nearby, looked like he wanted to explode. "Why are you asking them questions?" he demanded. "They don't know what they're talking about." Mary turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Their input is invaluable, Mr. Greg. They're the ones working in these conditions every day. Now, if you'd like to cooperate, I suggest you step back and let me do my job." The staff exchanged furtive smiles, emboldened by Mary's unwavering confidence. The inspection continued into the storage areas, where Mary discovered improperly labeled containers, leaking pipes, and a pest problem evidenced by mouse droppings in the corners. Greg's attempts to explain away each issue grew increasingly desperate, his excuses becoming more and more hollow. As Mary worked, the staff began to subtly rally around her. Ethan, the server who had complained about his shorted paychecks, approached her with a whispered thanks. Carla, the server who had been forced to work while sick, quietly slipped Mary a note detailing more of Greg's misdeeds. By the time Mary finished her inspection, she had enough evidence to write a report that would not only shut the restaurant down temporarily but also lead to severe penalties for Greg and the owners. She gathered the staff in the dining area, addressing them directly. "I want to thank all of you for your cooperation today," she said. "Your hard work and dedication deserve better than what I've seen here. I'll be filing my report immediately, and I'll ensure that steps are taken to improve your working conditions." The staff erupted into quiet applause, their relief palpable. Greg, on the other hand, stood frozen, his face pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. Mary turned to him with a final, piercing gaze. "Mr. Gregg, I suggest you start preparing for the consequences of your actions. This restaurant will be undergoing significant changes, and your behavior will not go unnoticed." With that, she walked out, clipboard in hand, leaving behind a room full of hopeful employees and a manager whose empire was about to crumble. The day Mary submitted her inspection report was the beginning of the end for Greg's tyrannical reign. Her findings were so thorough, so damning, that the Food Safety and Standards Board moved swiftly. The report outlined everything: expired ingredients, unsanitary equipment, mistreatment of staff, and a long list of health code violations. Attached to it were photographs and testimonies from employees who had endured Greg's abusive behavior. Within days, an official notice was sent to the restaurant's ownership, detailing the penalties, a significant fine, mandatory retraining for all staff, and an immediate, temporary closure for a complete overhaul of the facility. The news spread quickly, rippling through the local restaurant community and making headlines in industry publications. Greg received the news first. A representative from the inspection board arrived early in the morning with the closure notice. Mary had ensured that the timing coincided with the start of the workday, guaranteeing that the staff would witness the moment Greg was stripped of his power. "What do you mean we're shut down?" Greg bellowed at the inspector, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You can't do this. I run a clean operation." The inspector, a stoic man in a navy blazer, handed Greg the paperwork. "Mr. Gregg, your operation is far from clean. The evidence speaks for itself. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises and comply with the terms outlined in this document." Greg's face turned an alarming shade of red. He turned to the staff, most of whom were standing silently in the dining area, watching the exchange with wide eyes. "This is all a mistake," he shouted. "Don't listen to this nonsense. We'll be back in business in no time." But the staff didn't seem convinced. Many of them looked relieved, their shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. A few even exchanged furtive smiles, knowing Greg's days of unchecked cruelty were over. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Keating, was next to receive the news. He was a middle-aged man with a carefully cultivated image of professionalism, but when he read Mary's report, his hands trembled. The findings not only threatened his business, but also his reputation. Keating prided himself on running a high-class establishment, and the idea that his flagship restaurant had been operating under such deplorable conditions was a nightmare. Keating called a meeting with Mary and the inspection board. The room was tense as Keating sat across from Mary, his face pale. "I don't understand how this happened," he said, his voice strained. "I trusted Greg to manage the restaurant. He assured me everything was under control." Mary remained calm, her expression neutral. "Mr. Keating, the evidence is clear. Greg not only neglected his responsibilities, but also created a toxic work environment. The violations I found were extensive, and they didn't happen overnight. This was a long-term problem." Keating ran a hand through his graying hair, sighing heavily. "I don't condone any of this. I'll take full responsibility and ensure it never happens again." Mary's gaze softened slightly. "That's a step in the right direction. But responsibility also means making things right for your employees. They've endured a lot under Greg's management." Keating nodded slowly, his mind already racing with plans for damage control. "I'll do whatever it takes. This business means everything to me." The fallout for Greg was swift and unforgiving. Keating called him into his office the next day, delivering the news without preamble. "You're fired," Keating said bluntly, sliding a termination letter across the desk. "Your behavior and negligence have cost this business dearly. You've not only jeopardized the restaurant but also the livelihoods of every employee who works here." Greg's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. I've been loyal to this company for years." "Loyalty doesn't excuse incompetence," Keating replied coldly. "I've already notified the industry association about your actions. Don't expect to find work in this field again. Greg stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. With Greg gone, Mary turned her attention to the displaced employees. She had seen firsthand how hard they worked under impossible conditions, and she was determined to help them find better opportunities. Using her network, she contacted other restaurants and organizations in the area, sharing glowing recommendations for each staff member. Rosa, the talented cook who had endured Greg's penny-pinching policies, was offered a position at a boutique catering company known for treating its employees well. Carla, the server who had worked through sickness, was hired by a family-owned cafe with flexible hours. Danny, the young dishwasher with raw, cracked hands, was given a chance to train as a prep cook at a nearby culinary school, thanks to a scholarship Mary helped secure. Ethan, the server who had been shorted on his paychecks, was the last to leave. Before he walked out of the restaurant for the final time, he approached Mary. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Mary smiled warmly. "You all deserve better. I'm just glad I could help." The restaurant remained closed for weeks as it underwent a complete transformation. Keating invested heavily in renovations, replacing outdated equipment, repairing the walk-in cooler, and ensuring every surface was spotless. He also brought in new management, carefully vetting candidates to ensure they aligned with the company's values. When the restaurant finally reopened, it did so with a new name and a new mission, to prioritize quality, integrity, and the well-being of its staff. Mary was invited to the reopening ceremony, where Keating publicly thanked her for uncovering the truth. "I owe a debt of gratitude to Ms. Henderson," Keating said during his speech. "She held us accountable and reminded us that no business is above doing what's right." Mary accepted the thanks gracefully, but for her, the real reward was seeing the former staff members thriving in their new roles. As she left the ceremony, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Greg was gone, the workers had been given a fresh start, and the restaurant was finally on the path to redemption. It was a reckoning, yes, but also a new beginning. And Mary wouldn't have had it any other way. Months had passed since the dramatic closure of Greg's restaurant. For Mary, it had been a whirlwind of activity, with her role as an inspector expanding in unexpected ways. The fallout from her report had sparked discussions across the restaurant chain, forcing the company's leadership to reevaluate how their establishments were managed. Mary became an advocate for reform, her voice a powerful reminder that the industry's foundation was its workers, and they deserved to be treated with dignity. Mary's efforts began at the corporate level. She attended board meetings, armed with data and testimonials from the staff she had spoken to during her investigation. She proposed new policies, including mandatory management training, regular unannounced inspections, and an anonymous reporting system for employees to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. "There's no business without your people," she told the executives at one meeting. "If you treat them well, the quality of your food and service will reflect that." At first, there was resistance. Some board members balked at the cost of implementing Mary's suggestions, arguing that it would eat into their profits. But Mary was prepared. She presented a case study from a competitor that had embraced similar reforms, showing how employee satisfaction had led to higher customer retention and increased revenue. Slowly but surely, she won them over. Within weeks, the chain rolled out new policies. All managers were required to undergo leadership training focused on employee welfare and conflict resolution. Paychecks were monitored more closely to prevent wage theft, and employees were guaranteed breaks and proper protective equipment. The changes were implemented across every location, with Mary overseeing the process to ensure compliance. One crisp autumn morning, Mary decided it was time to revisit the restaurant where it all began. The once bustling establishment had reopened under new management and a new name, Haven's Table. The exterior had been revamped, with fresh paint and new signage that radiated warmth and welcome. The interior had undergone an equally dramatic transformation. Gone were the dingy floors and outdated furniture. Instead, the dining area was clean, modern, and inviting, with soft lighting and carefully curated decor that gave the space an upscale yet comfortable feel. As Mary stepped through the doors, she was greeted by the hum of activity and the mouth-watering aroma of freshly prepared food. A hostess approached her with a bright smile. "Welcome to Haven's table. Do you have a reservation?" Mary shook her head. "I'm just here for lunch." Before the hostess could respond, Rosa emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of steaming dishes. Her eyes widened when she saw Mary. "Mary! It's you," she exclaimed, setting the tray down and rushing over to hug her. The warm embrace caught Mary off guard, but she returned it with a smile. "It's good to see you, Rosa. How are things here?" "They're amazing," Rosa said, her voice brimming with excitement. "The new manager, Mr. Bennett, actually listens to us. We get fair schedules, proper breaks, and the kitchen is spotless now. I even got promoted to sous chef." Mary's heart swelled with pride. "That's wonderful, Rosa. You deserve it." Word of Mary's arrival spread quickly. Carla and Ethan appeared from the dining area, followed by Danny, who was now dressed in a crisp chef's uniform. They all greeted her with the same warmth and gratitude, their faces glowing with happiness. Mr. Bennett, the new manager, approached Mary with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. "Ms. Henderson, it's an honor to finally meet you. I've heard so much about what you did for this place." "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," Mary replied. "I'm glad to see the changes have made a difference." "They certainly have," Bennett said. "We owe a lot of our success to the foundation you helped lay. Would you let us treat you to a meal as a token of our gratitude?" Mary hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "I'd love that." Mary was seated at a corner table, with a clear view of the bustling restaurant. She watched as Rosa expertly guided the kitchen staff, Carla charmed customers with her cheerful demeanor, and Ethan efficiently managed the floor. Danny emerged from the kitchen carrying her meal, a beautifully plated dish of herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and a side of fresh-baked bread. As Mary took her first bite, she couldn't help but smile. The flavors were exquisite, a testament to the passion and skill of the people who had prepared it. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the laughter of customers, the harmonious rhythm of the staff, and the sense of pride that radiated from every corner. It was a far cry from the chaos and toxicity she had encountered months ago. The restaurant was no longer just a place to eat, it was a haven, a community built on respect and collaboration. When Mary finished her meal, Mr. Bennett approached her with the check, but Mary noticed it was blank. "This one's on the house," he said with a wink. "Thank you," Mary said, standing up and shaking his hand. "But the real reward is seeing all of you thrive." As she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filled her lungs, and she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Mary had set out to right a wrong, but in doing so, she had ignited a movement that extended far beyond one restaurant. Walking away from Haven's table, Mary reflected on how one act of courage and determination could ripple outward, creating change that touched countless lives. It was, indeed, a new chapter, for the workers, for the restaurant, and for Mary herself.